Would you say it's a good idea in this case to look at history and potentially be scared of what happened, let's say, in World War II, what led up to World War II, and for example, as an Iranian, I've been reading a lot of Iranian history. It's kind of become a joke that, oh, like after Trump, for example, came, it was like, oh, we had another president, Ahmadinejad, who was basically the same, populist and nationalist kind of character. But with the revolution itself, we also had, as you said, people who weren't represented by this rise of cosmopolitanism. Uh, they they basically followed the religious clergy and had a revolution. Would that be a good measure to look at the past?
Um, so I do think that we live in a riskier world than we have lived that than 10 or 20 years ago. I do think we have probably more to fear of um, than I do think that we have more to fear of than most of us think. And this is again to do with this dominant narrative that has basically been mainstream for the last 40 years at the very least, which is that some sort of a liberal peace has we have entered some kind of era of a liberal peace, end of history, um, holding hands and so on. Um, by the way, I am a liberal, right? So I you know, my criticisms of liberalism does not come from a place of being anti-liberal. I think there is an issue that liberals sometimes don't see certain things, right? So liberals don't see often like ethnic or group identities or real differences that matter to people, and kind of choose to think that these can be ignored or mediated by institutions, and I mean that's kind of uh, where that tends to go. Now, I think that now what we, on one hand, it is a riskier and more fearful situation than has been 20 years ago. On the other hand, we don't know, and I think I don't know certainly what a potential conflict, or what the potential what it is that we should actually be afraid of, right? So because if you are my mom, then every time then Russia says something, that she says that it's going to be World War III, and we're going to be under some sort of foreign rule. That's basically what she's afraid of. Is this what we should be afraid of? Probably no. I mean, if you look at um, how I mean, the general trend uh, is that around the world, countries have been changing their militaries in a way that makes them much easier to threaten, cause damage, and intervene, cause also civil unrest, globally. So this is through cyber warfare, primarily. Um, but actually, troops on the ground and occupation, right, is very much not the type of threats that we tend to, at least globally, that seem to be increasing. The What's going to define the sort of the next battleground is going to be the conflict between the US and China, right? And specifically, that conflict now seems to be taking the form of a technology race. And it's a technology race around the ownership of the IP, the platforms, and so on, that will be collecting information, allowing social control, allowing infrastructure control, allowing innovation, powering basically that is the next space race, right? That's basically it is around technology and IP. Um, is Does that mean that, for instance, alternative threats such as terrorism could sorry, cyber terrorism and cyber warfare could be more on the map, probably, right? So that's probably one thing that we'll be afraid of. But I have another hypothesis, and this is that actually, instead of a big conflict, what we might be seeing is an ideological battle, because, and not an ideological battle that will happen between minds, but I guess if you create sufficient distrust in in what's called the West, although it's a horrible way of calling anything, but if you look at Western liberal democracies, and if you can cause sufficient distrust in public institutions, and if you can cause sufficient ownership of, or at least concern around ownership and privacy around data, if you create a society, which I think COVID is helping to many extent, in which individuals are happy to outsource their personal risk to the state and simply say, track me, right? Let's have an app for this, and let's get a COVID vaccine passport and this and that and so on. Actually, I accept a level of intrusion, of tracking, of interference in my life because of the benefits, which are security, welfare, things like that. Then the question is whether at some point that creates some kind of a convergence between the sort of the Chinese model and the and the liberal democratic model, or actually the only way you can defend our liberal democratic rights and freedoms is through creating some kind of a super state, right? That kind of tracks us and keeps us safe. And that would, of course, be a situation in which actually the conflict between China and the West is resolved in a sense through some kind of a convergence, where actually these systems stop being really opposing each other, right? And then maybe some systems start buying Chinese technology, right? Because that's the point. I think what China is interested in is not to occupy Spain or occupy Germany, but would they want to own every AI system in a Spanish school? Of course they would, right? So I think this is the type of control that we will be fighting for. It's going to be ownership of our data, our lives, and our communities in the end.